The MPTF Media Center presents the international premiere podcast of Mystery Theater Audibles, Blackfire, a science fiction fantasy novel written and narrated by Anthony Lawrence, directed and produced by Madeline Smith Lawrence, produced by Jennifer Clymer, sound engineered by Marcus Murrieta.
Chapter 88. I moved into Daniel's bedchamber, fearing the worst. I wasn't sure it was what I was going to do to him or what he might do to me. Sure, Oren knew everything, but even he admitted there were limits to that knowledge. He had assured me that Daniel would not awaken within the prescribed time, no matter what happened or what I did to him. But how could I be certain of that? I had taken him at his word, but it was still possible that in this particular instance he could be wrong. What would happen to me if Daniel did awaken sooner than expected, or when I had the temerity to extract his teeth? Jesus, extract his teeth? Could I even do it? Was it actually possible, even with the forceps I carried in my pocket? Well, I tried to put those thoughts out of my mind as I moved slowly into the dimly lit room. Despite my misgivings, I was determined to carry out my task. I'd made my commitment, and it was time that I put down my doubts and fears and focused on what I had to do, no matter how depraved and vile it might seem. The end justifies the means, right? Yeah, maybe sometimes. I just wasn't sure this was one of those times. The room was lit by a series of huge candles that I could see were burning down and appeared to be timed in line with Daniel's awakening. From their short, stubby lengths and the wax accumulated at their bases, I knew that I had little time to spare. The room appeared quite Spartan and monistic, with only primitive tables and chairs. Daniel lay on a large bed with an ornately carved headboard. He was covered by an ancient and elaborately embroidered duvet, his head propped on large, silk-covered pillows. He was on his back, eyes closed, and his long, silver-streaked hair flowing onto the pillows. He seemed to be sleeping deeply and peacefully. And in Arcadia I am. There had always been somewhat of a mystery in art and literature circles regarding that phrase as used by Nicholas Poussin. Who is this person that says he is there? And just where is he? Was it simply a line from a poem? A cautionary reminder of the transitory nature of life and the inevitability of death? Or was it referring to some idyllic paradise? Maybe even here referring to some place where Daniel was visiting in dreams while he slept? I had no idea, and I really didn't give a shit, but I was only ruminating to somehow soften or distract myself from the real ordeal that I was about to undertake. I slowly reached into my pocket and took out the forceps. Chapter 89. Oren sat at the bar and was getting progressively drunker. He had managed to find his way down here because of the alcohol he had consumed from those miniature bottles, but he knew that he needed to continue drinking if he was going to be able to focus his thoughts in any manageable way. The overload was increasing, and he knew that it was only a matter of time before his brain, just like any computer, was going to crash. There were already signs that he was losing it. Control of his thoughts was slipping away, and only the alcohol was keeping him functioning at all. But that wasn't the worst of it. Oren's human form was continuing its strange biological transcendence. His hands and face and neck were taking on a more smooth, chrome-like appearance, glistening in the light, his fingers like metal spiders tracing along the edge of his drinking glass. But he knew that Rafe was going to run into difficulties in reclaiming the Blackfire opal, and he must be able to help him, just as he must help Jordan and Cody. But right now, Oren was deeply melancholy because he knew something else. He knew that his wife, whose name had become Samanya, had been killed. He had known it was coming for some time, but becoming aware that it had happened was still a great shock, and he was overwhelmed with a sense of loss. He also knew that the love he had for her in those early days on the farm had diminished right here in the resort when she, consumed with her obsessive desire for beauty and power, had managed to win those things by wagering with Daniel at table 18. Oren knew that she had never really loved him and had only married him for practical reasons. They had never been close in the way that Oren had wanted, but she was his wife, and Oren was the kind of man who remained loyal and loving no matter what the circumstances, so the loss was substantial even though he had known it would happen for some time. The feelings of grief and abandonment were very deep, and the madness that was creeping over him made him drink all the more heavily. Even the bartender, who knew him quite well by now, was eyeing him worriedly. He had long since stopped trying to give Oren subtle messages about restraint. He was certainly curious about this man who could drink so much, as well as ramble on in just about any language and on just about any subject. But he had long ago become used to the strange comings and goings of some pretty strange people, and had resigned himself to having a secure job in a beautiful place. Oren downed another drink quickly as thoughts invaded his mind. He knew that death was rarely permanent, and that Samanya would reappear in some place and time. But she'd had no arrangement with Daniel for a resurrection anytime soon, so where and when he might see his wife again appeared to be one of those few things that Oren didn't know. But as the alcohol's effects calmed his brain, he began to become aware of something very powerful pulling at him. Several things at the same time that were sounding extreme alarms. It was hard for him to concentrate. He had to struggle for each thought, and for the first time, he had very strong feelings of self-doubt that seemed to be overwhelming. Chapter 90. Father Matus had arrived in the lobby. His piercing eyes scanned the area for some sign of the boy. He had to find him because the feelings deep within were rising to desperate heights. He knew he could never leave this place, and he also knew there would be few, if any, children available to him here. Children were not allowed, and the boy's presence here was simply an accident of fate. But he had to find him. He had murdered his mother to gain access to him. The desire inside the priest was just too strong to control. He had to find Cody. Then he saw her. She had popped into the lobby from outside, pushing past people to get in. She was still obviously searching for her son, but it couldn't be possible. He had killed her. He had strangled her with piano wire. But as he watched her from the shadows, he knew nothing here was impossible. He himself had regained his youth. That had not seemed possible at the time, but it had happened. So why couldn't she come back from the dead? Father Matus did not know that Jordan had an arrangement with Daniel that had to do with dying multiple times, but the priest knew that things could happen here that were not possible anywhere else. He knew that his notions of life and death had evolved long ago when he had become driven to kill false prophets and others who had threatened him. And when he came here and found his youth again, he discovered a new and profound source of God's intervention through Daniel, whom he believed to be a real prophet, an instrument of the Holy Father. Now he realized that he must find another way to eliminate Cody's mother, some other way that would not allow her to return. Then he would be free to seek out the boy. Chapter 91. I stood there in the dark, staring down at Daniel's sleeping face. I held one of the forceps in my hand, but I was frozen, unable to begin. Was it my imagination, or was he grinning up at me with his eyes closed? Had his mouth been shut before? I could see his glistening white teeth now, and they were, what had Oren said, dazzling like the sun coming up in the morning. It was true. How could I do it? Suppose he woke up, even though Oren had assured me he wouldn't. What if this devil of a man woke up while I was yanking out his fucking teeth? How could I be sure? All I could do at this point was to tell myself to stop being a pussy and go for it. So if he woke up, I'd blast his ass with a couple from my Glock 22 sidearm. Okay, bad idea. But I figured I had to have some backup plan, and I was short on cleverness right then. Best thing was to just keep remembering what Oren had quoted from Poe, that teeth have always been equated with aggression. They endure, survive beyond death, transcend death. I reached out with the forceps in my right hand while holding the Glock 22 in my left, just in case. I used the pointed tip of the gun barrel to slowly push back Daniel's upper lip just far enough so that I could get a firm grip on one of his front incisors. He stirred slightly as the gun touched his lip, but he continued to sleep soundly, his breathing rhythm unchanged. I clamped the bite of the forceps on the major front tooth and prepared to wrench the fucking thing out of his mouth. I was sweating like a pig, and a droplet from my cheek plopped onto his face, but he never moved, and I went for it. Well, it wasn't anything like I expected. Hell, I'd had a couple of my own teeth extracted. Sure, I'd had Novocaine and didn't feel anything, but sure as shit heard that sound it made as the tooth was pulled from my gum. It was a terrible sound, a kind of wrenching, twisting, cracking sound. One of those things you remember. But pulling Daniel's tooth was like pulling a little boy's shoe out of the mud. Just a slight tug and it came out with little or no resistance. The roots didn't appear to have anything like the normal human attachment to the gum. It was like a separate false tooth implanted as a temporary. There was no blood and no reaction. No pain, no strain. Christ, maybe this was going to turn out to be a piece of cake after all my mind-fucking. I slipped the incisor into my pocket and went back for more. The next one came out just as easily. I'd started with the upper front, and I worked my way backward on both sides, zapping out the molars, clean as a whistle. Daniel never stirred. I started popping those fuckers out fast and furious. Both sides of his uppers were in my pocket before 5 minutes had passed. I was right on schedule, and I was almost beginning to enjoy it. It was easy, it was clean, and I was saving the world, right? Or maybe, according to Oren, lots of worlds, multiverses, shit like that. Well, I went to work on his lowers, and before I knew it, I was extracting his very last tooth. That's when all hell broke loose. His whole body started to shudder, then went into convulsions. I backed away in a hurry, and I could almost hear those teeth rattling in my pocket. Daniel suddenly shot to his feet next to the bed, his body racked with convulsive spasms. His eyes opened wide and stared right at me in obvious surprise and shock, his mouth yawning and becoming a black hole that expanded beyond normal. It looked like the entrance of a cavern, a toothless orifice that stretched his face out of proportion. A howl came out of that dark maw that made every nerve in my body go crazy. It was a yowl, a scream that might have shattered glass. Then Daniel went into seizure and heaved like a sick drunk, a dry vomit with a retching roar that brought up the Blackfire opal from his stomach and onto the floor. It was wet with his gut fluids and slid across the surface toward my feet. My handkerchief was out in an instant. I scooped up that jewel so fast I never had a moment to examine it, and he never had a chance to retrieve it, even if he had tried. Believe me, if he had taken a step toward me, I would have blasted away with my Glock 22 like a fucking jackhammer and rendered whatever he was into dog meat. He was still yowling when I hit the door. Chapter 92. Cody huddled knees to chest in the dark space he had spotted between two video slots. He had spotted the priest moving through the dwindling crowds in the lobby and had darted quickly to the first place he could find so as not to be seen. He really didn't understand why the man frightened him so much, but he knew he had to avoid him at all cost. He craned his neck and head slightly so that he could see any sign of the priest, but as he moved slowly into the light, he heard a soft and strange-sounding voice very near him whisper, "Not yet, Cody. He's still out there." Cody's eyes widened as he glanced around to see the source of the words, but he couldn't see anyone close enough to be responsible. "Just stay where you are, and I'll let you know when the coast is clear." The voice was so close it was almost in his ear. It sounded like it was coming directly from the video slot to the left, but that couldn't be possible. "Who said that?" Cody inquired softly and warily. "It was me, Cody," the voice said with a kind of digital staccato as the lights on the video display blinked colorfully. Cody stared upward at the slot in amazement. From his angle, he could only barely see the slanted display screen on the front side of the slot. He stared at it because he couldn't believe it was the source of the voice, but also because it somehow seemed different than all the rest of the machines he had seen lined up separately and in carousel formation all over the hotel lobby. Cody had grown up in and around casinos his whole life. When he was very small and waiting for his mother to finish work, he would often play among the slots, pretending they were his friends and using the dark spaces between them as hiding places. His mother had been a dealer and house manager. She had even let him play some penny machines once in a while when she thought nobody would notice. He recognized the simple poker-style variation of numbers and symbols, horseshoes, diamonds, spades, hearts, clubs, and a Liberty Bell, but most other machines had fairly recognizable themed game displays, some of which featured graphics and music based on popular entertainers, motion pictures, or TV programs. But as Cody strained forward to see more of the front of this display, he found it totally unfamiliar and significantly different looking than the others. Its theme seemed to be centered on a curious figure that Cody had never seen before. It was a man dressed in peculiar clothing from some other time and place, a high collar and a scarlet vest, with a colorfully decorated and embroidered coat that flowed down below his waist. He wore a silvery cape and had long, silky white hair, a slick mustache, tipped up at the ends, and very dark, somewhat mischievous eyes. He appeared to be flying through the air like some odd and eccentric superhero from some other time and space. It appeared to be neither the future or the past, but some place and some time in between. "Did you talk to me?" Cody asked softly with little expectation of a reply. "Yes, I did," the voice answered with a quiet confidence and a good deal of arrogance. "Who are you?" asked Cody with rising alarm. "I am called Charlie Famous. I was named in honor of Charlie Fay, the inventor of the very first slot machine in 1887 San Francisco." Cody couldn't accept what he was hearing. He whipped his head back and forth to see if someone was playing a joke on him, but there was no sign of anyone in the vicinity, and he was afraid to stick his head out too far for fear that he would be noticed by the priest. "You can't talk. You're a machine," Cody blurted out as his heart began to race. "Nonsense. A lot of these machines here can talk, but it's just their programming. I am different. I can think." "Slot machines can't think," insisted Cody adamantly. "They're just games to play and make money." "That used to be true, Cody, but I'm something quite new. I'm called a prototype. I am mounted just like any other full-size, show-ready slot machine, but I have internal modifications that make me greater than the sum of all my parts. First, there was the simple bell machine, then high hand, and money honey, reel 'em, and 3 bags full, then multi-line and hybrids, and now me, Charlie Famous, a true synthetic intelligence machine." Cody was getting frightened and wanted to get away from what he was hearing. He didn't understand it, and it was beginning to terrify him just as much as the priest, but he didn't know where he could go, and he couldn't seem to make his body move. "Oh, God, where's Mom?" "You don't need to be scared of me, Cody. I want to help you." The digital voice was calm, and in a strange way, kind of soothing, but still Cody was suspicious and uncertain. "How can you help me?" Suddenly, the video display became more animated, with multicolored lights flashing and pulsating graphics arcing back and forth. The poker symbols lined up with a perfect straight flush and the lights blinked furiously, illustrating bonus features that Cody couldn't quite make out. "You've won my bonus, Cody, and you now have residual credits that must be either played or abandoned." "I don't know what you're talking about. I didn't play. I didn't do anything." Cody was on the verge of sobs, confused, his fear mounting despite the machine's reassurances. "The play is automatic based on your brain waves. Now, if you want to avoid the priest, then you must follow me, Cody." "Follow you? How can I follow you? You can't move." "Of course I can. I am completely wireless and automated. I am the first of my kind, Cody. I am designed to be a portable entertainment unit. Rather than just waiting to be used, I can seek out and provide wagering for those who need it. You have won my bonus feature, so my very advanced EEPROM computer system can provide the help you need. Just follow me." Cody was startled as the machine started to slide smoothly forward, with its video display vibrating and lights flashing. "But where are we going?" Cody cried out. "Where you can get help in finding your mother," said Charlie Famous. "At table 18. Chapter 93. I'd done it! I had Daniel's teeth in the Blackfire opal rattling around in my pockets. Just thinking about that made me even more uncertain of my sanity. But I was saving humankind. Hell, I wasn't even sure about that. One thing I knew, though, it was too soon to celebrate. I wanted to take out that so-called enchanted opal and take a good look at it, but I was just outside the toothless son of a bitch's door, and I had a long ways to go. I felt a definite sense of relief, but it was mixed with an ongoing and overwhelming wave of terror that wasn't about to let up just yet. I was at the halfway point on an extreme roller coaster ride, and I still wasn't sure I would live through it. I leaned back against the stone wall and took one long, deep breath. Why couldn't I just zap myself out of here now with that time and space mind control I'd used before? I don't think I didn't try. I concentrated, bit my lip, and sweated, but I wasn't going anywhere except on my feet or as dead meat. But I remembered Oren had said it was harder to use getting in and out of here. And that being the case, there was one thing I definitely should have asked him at the very beginning of this most dangerous job. If you know everything, just give me a simple and direct answer. Was I going to make it out of here alive? Then I knew that wouldn't have worked. If I'd known I wasn't going to make it, I wouldn't have gone. And if I'd known I was going to make it, I probably wouldn't have believed it anyway. I wasn't exactly the most trusting kind of guy, considering my background. But take a neurotic and damaged guy with low self-esteem and make him think he's something special. What a fucking bonehead decision I'd based on that kind of smoke up my ass. In that moment of brilliant, panicky contemplation just outside Daniel's door, I could still hear his unearthly yowl, together with some loud smashing sounds like he was taking out his fury on anything he could get hold of. I figured he'd be busting through that door any second. God only knew what he might or could do to me, gun or no gun. I mean, he wasn't exactly some harebrained drug pusher, and I wasn't exactly some loyal or even your average disgruntled employee. He wasn't human, and I had defiled him in a way he wasn't going to take lightly. I knew I had to move fast. I quickly scanned the area for some sign of that alternate route that I had avoided in order to get to the bedroom suite before Daniel awoke. But I could see no other corridor than the one leading directly to the kitchen. Christ knows I wanted to avoid going back through there. Being kissed by those Cupid doll lips or by that meat cleaver was not my idea of a good time. Beyond the bedroom suite, I could see another massive set of double doors. Maybe the alternate corridor was on the other side of those doors. I had little time to consider my options. I had to act quickly. Daniel's yowling and the smashing sounds had abruptly ceased, but I felt no more confident with the silence than I had with the noises. I charged straight for those huge doors, not really sure what was on the other side. I could hear this weird noise coming from inside. It sounded like some kind of horn that I'd never heard before. But checking it out still seemed a better option than waiting for Daniel to come raging after me like some avenging creature who just might actually gum me to death. I slowly took hold of one of the huge, elaborately sculpted silver door handles, turned it and pushed slightly so that I could just get a glimpse of what was beyond. What I saw lit me up in ways I thought I had left far behind. It appeared to be an enormous banquet room, decorated like something out of the Middle Ages with ancient yet alien tapestries on the walls, curiously designed antiquities on a series of marble-looking mantels that were indescribable. But at the center of the vast hall was something that brought a very specific event to my mind. There were a group of candlelit figures gathered around the far side of a long refectory table covered with what looked like some kind of archaic woven muslin fabric. I couldn't make out the food that was on the large pewter plates in front of them, but the dim lighting and the way the figures were gathered around the table made me instantly recall the images I had seen as a boy of the Last Supper, especially Da Vinci's huge and impressive visual interpretation of the event chronicled in all 4 of the Gospels. In that instant, all my Catholic upbringing surged into my mind and seemed to create overwhelming sensory recall. And I was once again a 10-year-old altar boy performing my duties. Looking reverent and attentive, I could feel my black shoes and pants, the cassock and surplice white vestment. I could hear the ringing of the bells and feel the wine cruet in my hands. But I knew full well that I was not looking at the celebration of the Eucharist, nor the figures of Christ and his disciples. At the left end of the group, where Bartholomew must have sat in the original biblical setting, was a figure that put an instrument to an area where his mouth must have been, and made that strange sound I had heard from outside the hall. But what I assumed was a musical instrument lit up by the flickering candles chilled my blood. It looked like a human thigh bone. Chapter 94. Jordan felt frustrated and sick. She had searched everywhere downstairs, all through the lobby and the malls and the casinos. But even as dawn was approaching and the throngs of people had begun to thin out, she had seen no sign of Cody or Father Matus. She was still shaken and trembling from her encounter just outside the casino with the costumed crab man from the golf course. But even as he had terrified her, there was still something kind of tragic and pathetic about him. It was difficult reconciling what she had seen and experienced. But what else was new around here? Since she had arrived at this strange place, she had been subjected to a series of macabre and fantastic ordeals that seemed to include multiple death and resurrection experiences for both Cody and herself. Maybe it was all really just a long nightmare from which she would eventually awaken. At least there was some comfort in believing that. The other possibilities were less appealing. Psychotic delusions made even some sense, but to accept that this was all really happening to her in some alternate reality was simply incomprehensible. Her frame of logic still couldn't accept that. She tried to push the confusion and uncertainty from her mind so that she could continue her search for Cody. That was a simple, if desperate, objective on which she could focus. She had dismissed the obvious things that any other mother might have done. She didn't trust the usual sources one might go to for information about a missing boy. How could she seek out the staff and plead with them to help her find her son? In this place, you didn't need to be paranoid to believe people were out to get you. At first, the employees had appeared pretty much like all those she had known in hotels and casinos where she had worked. But it was very rapidly apparent that the people working here were intensely loyal to only one man, and that was Daniel Corinthus, the master of the cards, the charmingly sinister character who seemed to hover everywhere in some invisible and malevolent presence. If you looked really close, you noticed that all the staff members walked around in a kind of trance state. They performed their duties with exceptional pleasantness and polish, but there was also a cold, aloof quality that was disturbing. Other than Rafe, there had only been one person in whom she felt some measure of trust, and she had so far been unable to locate him. Where was Rafe? What had happened to him? Was he safe? She could only guess and hope she would see him again soon. She knew she had fallen in love with Rafe because her heart rate increased every time she thought about him. There were only two people in her life that she cared about, and right now she couldn't find either one. Desperation and despair were like two sides of the same coin, and it was only the thought of seeing Rafe and Cody again that somehow kept her going. She wasn't completely sure that she trusted the priest, and she couldn't think of anyone else who might be able to help her. He had seemed sincere and sympathetic, and had made an effort in her search for Cody, but there had been no sign of him down in the lobby or any place else, so she had come back up to his room and was standing just outside in the corridor, having rung the bell and waited. After a few moments, the door had opened slowly, and a man stood staring at her. But it wasn't Father Matus. It was Oren, and he was staggering slightly, holding a half-empty bottle of gin in one hand. He smiled drunkenly, his eyes bleary and struggling to focus. He looked haggard and distraught, a man slowly and steadily deteriorating from the constant effects of alcohol and a kind of brainstorm of heterogeneous information beyond his mind's capacity to absorb. But while Oren's face was still human-like, it wasn't entirely human. He was going through his singularity, or metamorphosis, like the pupa into a butterfly, and his features were taking on a more metallic sheen, gleaming and perfectly smooth. "I knew you'd come here," he stammered unevenly. Jordan regarded him warily, only vaguely remembering him from their brief encounter in the casino, but ill-prepared for the astonishing changes to his face. Your face? Yes, I know. Nothing I can do about that now." "Where's Father Matus?" she asked tentatively. "All of special relativity is quite wrong. Did you know that?" he offered in his often disconnected way as he fought off the stream of consciousness that continued to flood into his head. Einstein was wrong, see? Light doesn't travel at a constant speed. It takes shortcuts through different dimensions. Then he took a quick slug of gin from the bottle and seemed to pull his thoughts together. "You need to be afraid, Jordan." "Are you serious? I haven't been anything else since I got here." "I mean, of the priest." "You're drunk." "I haven't been anything else since I got here," he mimicked her with a grin. "But I know about the priest. I tried to shoot him, but I couldn't handle it. Too much alcohol and too much data. My hands shake and I can't see straight. But you can do it." He took a small .38 from his pocket and offered it to Jordan. She looked at the gun like it was a snake. "I don't know what the hell you're talking about. Put that away. Where is Father Matus?" "Looking for Cody." "That's why you've got to shoot him. I won't kill him, but it will stop him from..." Oren's face tensed as he struggled to keep his focus, but something else was forcing itself into his mind. He quickly grabbed Jordan's hand, thrust the revolver into it. "Find him! Shoot him!" Suddenly he began slapping at his ears with both palms, and his face reflected his great distress. "My ears! Oh my God, my ears!" Then he slammed the door in her face. Chapter 95. He was playing the thigh bone like a trumpet. I could hear it, a thin, high succession of piercingly discordant notes, just as I'd heard it outside the double doors, but it couldn't be. Was I imagining it? I was fully aware of the sound, but I couldn't believe what I was hearing. In fact, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. What had seemed like the images of Christ and his apostles seated at the Last Supper appeared to be morphing and becoming something quite different and horrific in the flickering yellow light of the candles on the long table. It had to be a delusion. I suddenly felt like I was under the influence because the images seemed miasmatic and changing in a kind of fluctuation of form and size. No, what I was seeing wasn't possible. What I had first determined was a benign group of biblical figures now seemed to be angry and malicious, unimaginable beings in various deformed caricatures of humanity. They were terrifying, monstrous, demon-like creatures, grisly, raw, huge and monstrous, with dripping fangs, nostrils flaming, open jaws revealing dark, foul black throats. They were feasting from large, round platters of human flesh and bones. The silvery pewter plates reflected from the light like small lakes of blood, with mounds of glistening fat and piles of gleaming bones. The only disgusting creature not actually eating was the one on the end playing the thigh-bone trumpet, with blasts that keened shrilly throughout the room. I was stunned and stood there in the doorway for a long moment, shocked by what I was seeing and hearing. The thigh-bone trumpet shrieking made my skin crawl. The whole scene made my stomach turn. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw up. I was frozen in total revulsion. But only for a moment. Then I turned and ran. I ran like the devil's own were after me, and I wasn't sure that wasn't exactly the case. I headed back the way I had come, straight for the kitchen doors, certain that nothing I had seen or experienced there could be worse than the bloody feast I had just witnessed. Wrong. I lowered my body and pressed through the kitchen doors. I still held my service pistol in my hand, although I was more and more convinced that it would be of little use to me here. What good is a gun in a nightmare? This all had to be a nightmare, no matter how real it might appear. My God, I had just seen a bunch of fucking monsters. Give me a break. How real could that be? I seemed to be locked into some kind of prolonged nightmare, a delusional state, and there didn't seem to be any waking up or magic cure in the near future. There was only one thing that I could do: survive. I kept saying that one word over and over in my head. I was going to survive no matter what the hell was thrown at me. That was the good news about growing up the hard way. It taught you to be a survivor. That's what I had always been for as long as I could remember, and that's what I was going to be now. Bring it on, motherfuckers! Then there's always the bad news. Although I wasn't asking for what happened next, it pushed me to the fucking edge. Something in my mind was putting two and two together as I once again heard the whining Chinese lute and smelled the incense. It was an odor that mingled with the incense that kept my stomach churning. It was linked with the overwhelming thought that what I had seen and smelled in that huge banquet room had originated right here in Hell's Kitchen. But there was no choice now. I had to get through here. I tried to stay quiet as I crouched low and made my way back in the shadows along the base of the black granite kidney-shaped preparation areas and the bulky butcher blocks. I caught just a glimpse of that massive, white-painted bald head with the almond eyes and the Cupid doll scarlet lips. He appeared to be working over one of the huge stainless steel Wolf oven ranges. I wasn't sure it was the same grotesque sous chef I had seen on my earlier way through. I had seen other hands at work, so I knew there had to be more than one. I stopped suddenly and froze in my crouched position as I stared at the hands working just above me near one of the many induction hot plates. The enormous calloused fingers were stuffing whole garlic cloves into slitted holes in a large chunk of meat. But it wasn't the thought of what that meat might be that sickened me to the core. It was the fact that as I traced upward along the hands that were working past the thick wrists, I could see no sign of the owner of those hands. The arms just kept getting longer and longer, as if they were not arms at all, but huge, fat fire hoses that stretched out and just went on and on. I was going nuts. I had to be. But the madness was only just beginning. I tried shutting my eyes for just a second, and then as I opened them again, I saw another pair of enormous, pudgy white hands rising up beyond the butcher block where I was crouching. They were just hands with the same stout wrists and fire hose arms rising upward above me like white anacondas. But one of the snakes held a large wooden spoon in its curled, burly fist mouth. It came down toward me like a deadly fly swatter, and I knew in that instant that I was the fly. Thunk! The scoop of the wooden spoons shattered into tiny fragments on the edge of the butcher block, and I had to shut my eyes again to avoid the slivers. My heart was banging in my chest like a circus drum, and I could hardly breathe. I was suddenly looking up at the face of a monstrous, bulky creature with a white painted fleshy face and really red Cupid doll lips. Its night-black almond eyes were staring at me with a fixed expression that I could only recognize as fury and indignation, as if I were some rival chef bent on stealing precious and secret recipes. My mind was screaming, "Run! Get the fuck out of here!" But I couldn't move. My body had gone rigid, just like when I had peered into the banquet room at the monsters around that table. But I had been some distance from those creatures. Believe it or not, horrible as they were, it was much less terrifying than staring up at this gross face that was within a few feet and staring at me like I might have regarded a filthy rat in my own kitchen. Chapter 96. Cody followed Charlie Famous through the casino. Dawn light filtered in through the large glass windows like thin, melting shadow fingers. Only a few hard-case high rollers were still slinking from casino to casino. They were trying to recover their losses or improve on already exorbitant winnings. Either way, they seemed like lost souls, their minds dimmed by too much liquor, their resistance fouled by the lure of possibilities. They hardly noticed that a curiously incongruous, flickering digital slot machine was floating along the thick carpetway, followed closely by a small boy. Charlie Famous stopped at the entrance of the room in which the darkly carved Table 18 sat prominently and somewhat ominously. The room appeared to be otherwise empty. The slot turned slowly to Cody, who stood close by and was glancing warily around. "You must wait right here, Cody," the machine said definitively. "Why?" asked Cody with a good deal of suspicion. "Don't you want to see your mother?" "I don't see her." "She'll be here soon. Just be patient." "Is this all I get for winning your bonus?" "You're very cynical for one so young," said the machine, its digital tone becoming slightly sinister. Why should I believe a machine with such a stupid name? Before Charlie Famous could direct a sarcastic reply, there was a sound that came from the Table 18 room that drew both their attentions. It was a kind of yowling sound. Cody glanced into the room and the slot turned toward the sound. A figure appeared slowly on the far side of the table. It was like something coming out of a fog or a magician's illusion. It was Daniel Corinthus, whose face was still distorted with fury, eyes wide and fearsome, and his mouth a toothless black hole that yawned wide and yowled.